Hey, friends. I was listening to the latest, not the latest episode, the latest episode that I have listened to of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis by John Vervaeke. And it pushed some buttons. So this is episode, I believe, 22 or 21. It's the one where he talks about Martin Luther. And I'm gonna do probably a horrible job summarizing, but there's a kind of key point that I want to um, touch on because it's the one that resonated with me, where I was like, "Whoa, this feels kind of kind of profound." So basically, he talks about Martin Luther, and he talks about the way that Luther's revolution was taking place in a context in which meaning, the making of meaning, had been pretty radically altered for people because of the advent of Galileo's insights into and just prior to that Copernicus, um, into no longer into heliocentrism, basically, like the idea that the sun is at the center of our orbiting of the bodies that we watch orbit as opposed to the earth, along with the advent of a couple of other elements in society like uh, the merchant class and the rise of commerce as a form of power, versus the what had always been a traditional in years past, in centuries past. Power had been something essentially controlled by the church and controlled by the aristocracy, royalty. Now all of a sudden you can accumulate power through your own work. So there's, which obviously some of these things are positive developments, but they're also fundamental shifts, and in some ways they destabilize the ways in which culture had made it meaning for a long period of time. Luther comes along, talks about how the church, how the only connection required to speak to God is a direct connection. We don't need an intermediary anymore. And not only that, but all that is required to be saved is this almost arbitrary belief. It's our belief, our through an act of will accepting the reality of Christ. That becomes the road to salvation. That becomes the path to salvation. And it's a path in which we can't do anything except for believe fervently. Again, I said I was going to mangle this in summarizing it, but the point he makes, I think very compellingly, is that this revolution, or Reformation, as it was called, starts to sow into our culture he calls it the grammar. Basically, it's the thinking that will eventually be called narcissism, because it's a kind of radical and sort of all-consuming individualism, where the way in which we experience salvation is no longer based on a history of practices and institutions that support and that mold and to which we are accountable, but also from which we can receive inherited wisdom. Now it is our own conviction. It's everything is located within us. And so there's a radical focus on ourself. There's an incredible kind of turning of the gaze towards our own personal relationship to God. And again, it's really interesting to sort of be listening to this history and hear at least some things in there that feel positive, while at the same time clearly having to sort of see and accept that some of the ways in which the nature of our cultural relationship to authority, to wisdom, to the divine, to the supernatural even changed. Some of those changes that were made that took place back then, you can really kind of see the seeds of the modern meaning crisis. This hyper individual, hyper autonomy, and he also points out there's a kind of craving of specialness, because the arbitrariness of God's salvation, of God's saving of sinners, means that there's really nothing we can do to ensure that we are saved, or even to know whether we will be. We can believe it, and that's of course that's the imperative, is believe. If you believe you are saved, then you are saved. Well, but the thing is, human beings being human beings, we're going to want to prove that to ourselves. So how do we go about proving that? Well, we have to go and find reasons. We have to go and discover ways in which we are special. We are uniquely different than other people, and we are the saved over and above the other masses. And especially once we sort of like disconnect that impulse, that sort of like personal salvation impulse, once we disconnect that from the church, from any kind of, which happens later, obviously it doesn't happen with Luther, but it happens as that culture secularizes over the past several centuries, we can really start to see the modern meaning crisis, the craving for ways in which we are special, that relentless need to be seen in a certain way. I mean, it tracks all the way up through the social media age. And the reason why I say this pushed buttons for me is because I noticed it in my own thinking. I notice it in my own thinking. One of the phrases that Vervaeke keeps using is, our salvation comes from, or our potential salvation comes from, an unearned grace, an unearned merit. And again, because there's kind of nothing we can do. We don't need to go through certain practices. We don't need to go through certain rituals. We don't have to withstand certain ordeals. We don't have to perform certain tasks. We just have to have that personal conviction in the Creator, that hotline to God, man. That's what it all comes down to. And so, and the reason I say I've noticed this in myself is because I see that operating in myself. I see a need. It's not an adult need. It's not an actual need, but I see there's a psychological hankering for acknowledgement or specialness, being in a class of my own. And And it's not a fun feeling to see, or a fun pattern to see in my mind. It sort of takes me to a place where I'm like, whoa, really? Like this is my psychological substrate? Okay. Whoa. Let me just give me a minute to sit with that. Um, because that starts to really look like, sound like, it's like a kind of, it's like I'm a cult member in my own cult or something. Like that's weird. And I think, there's at least some, well, I don't know. I was going to say there's at least some movement. There's at least some cultural consciousness kind of creeping in about this. But this emphasis on the individual, and this understanding the individual to be the highest reference point, is on some level, I mean, and Vervaeke points this out. He says, in some cultures, this idea is considered bizarre. What on earth qualifies an individual to be the ultimate judge of their own behavior? Our legal system doesn't work like that. Our common sense communal relationships, we don't believe that. We don't buy that. And it's crazy in some ways that you'd say that you would consider, especially knowing how prone we can be to self-delusion, how completely blind we can be to ourselves. That's part of the point of transcendence and spiritual growth, is observing those ways in which we're unable to be objective about ourselves, not even really objective, but unable to see ourselves clearly. So the notion that we are our own final judge and jury on this is a weird one. Now, oddly, even as I articulate that, it's hard for part of me to not say, yeah, but what else is there? What else? What are you going to do if you give that up? We just take the word of a community, take the word of an external authority? And of course, I think, there's a variety of answers. There's a variety of answers of a variety of qualities. And it's not that simple. And I don't know that in this day and age, anyone would ever advocate jettisoning our own sense of trust in ourselves and our own willingness to allow ourselves to be guided by our own deeper intuition. But there is a way in which learning about this history has kind of changed the way I see it. It changed the way I see my own individualism. because I don't know that I don't know that I'm as immune from that emphasis on individual sort of self reference, which is ultimately kind of a narcissism. I don't know that I'm as immune from that as I might have thought I would be. When I've had it pointed out to me, not as a psychological phenomenon, but as a kind of cultural grammar, a way in which my thinking works, it's a little easier to see it. It's a little harder not to see it, let's say. And it's unsettling. It brings to light some things that, you know, if I were trying to avoid them, if I wanted to avoid them, I would consider them very unpleasant. I'm not really trying to avoid them, at least not consciously. So I'm kind of like excited about this discovery, but there's also a whoa. Let me sit with it for a minute and deal, because it does really kind of, it asks a lot of questions, asks a lot of pretty penetrating questions of my cultural orientation, my general view of myself in the world. So that's where I am today, people. Check out John Vervaeke, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It's amazing. Appreciate you. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you soon.